Uncover the latest mysteries before anyone else. By supporting our original Sherlock Holmes adventures on Patreon, you unlock early access to our stories long before their YouTube debut. Your monetary support is the secret to keeping this channel alive. The link to our Patreon is in the description below. It has been my privilege, over the course of my long and singular association with Mr. Sherlock Holmes, to chronicle a great many of his most remarkable cases. I have written of the terrifying hound that haunted the moors of Devonshire, of the bizarre mystery of the Sign of Four, and of that dark and fateful encounter at the Reichenbach Falls. Yet, as I review my notes for the year 1894, that momentous year which saw the return of my friend from the supposedly dead, I find among my records a case of such grotesque ingenuity and macabre execution that I have long hesitated to set it before the public. In my brief account of the affair of the Golden Pince-Nez, I made a passing allusion to it, referring to the repulsive story of the Red Leech and the terrible death of Crosby, the banker. At the time, the wound was too fresh, the methods of the murderer too shocking, and the implications too scandalous to permit a full rendering of the facts. Now, however, with the principal actors having long since passed beyond the reach of human tribunals, the seal of secrecy may be lifted. It is time the world knew the truth of what transpired in that gloomy mansion in Kensington during the sweltering May of that year. The month of May in 1894 was unseasonably hot. A heavy, oppressive languor had settled over London, baking the soot-stained bricks of Baker Street and turning the air in our sitting-room into a stagnant, suffocating haze. For 3 days, Holmes had scarcely moved from his armchair. He sat wrapped in his purple dressing-gown, his long, thin legs drawn up to his chin, his eyes fixed with a vacant, unblinking stare upon the geometric patterns of the Persian rug. The criminal classes of the metropolis, it seemed, had succumbed to the heat, and my friend's brilliant, restless mind was devouring itself in the absence of external stimulation. I, myself, was hardly in better spirits. An old Jezail bullet wound in my leg, a souvenir of the Afghan campaign, always throbbed when the barometric pressure dropped so precipitously. To distract myself, I was reading a rather dense treatise in the Lancet concerning the latest advancements in the extraction of cardiac glycosides, while occasionally glancing out the window at the shimmering heat haze that distorted the outlines of the hansom cabs rattling down the street. "It is a singular thing, Watson," Holmes remarked suddenly, his voice startlingly loud in the heavy silence. He had not turned his head, nor had his eyes shifted from the rug. How the most profound of human tragedies so often manifest in the most trivial and mundane of circumstances. I laid my medical journal upon my lap and looked at him. "To what do you refer, Holmes? I have seen no tragedy in the papers today, save the usual litany of petty thefts and drunken brawls." "I am not speaking of the papers, my dear doctor. I am speaking of the gentleman currently hesitating upon our doorstep." I sprang up and limped to the window, peering down through the dusty glass. A tall, impeccably dressed man in a dark frock coat and a silk top hat was pacing back and forth on the pavement. He held a silver-headed walking stick, which he repeatedly tapped against his polished boots in a rhythm that bespoke extreme nervous agitation. Twice he approached our door, his hand raised toward the bell, and twice he retreated, looking nervously over his shoulder as though he feared he was being followed. "How did you know he was there?" I asked in astonishment. You have not moved from that chair in 3 hours, and the window is behind you." Holmes smiled faintly, a brief, cynical curling of the lips. "My dear Watson, you look, but you do not listen. For the past 5 minutes I have been tracking the progress of those boots. They are heavy boots, custom-made, with a distinct metal cleat upon the left heel. I heard them approach from the direction of Oxford Street. They stopped directly beneath our window. The pacing indicated indecision. The tapping of the walking stick, a heavy stick, judging by the resonance, likely weighted with lead, suggested an anxiety born of sudden, shocking trauma rather than a long-standing grievance. Furthermore, the scent of expensive cigar smoke and a faint trace of macassar oil drifted up through the open window, informing me that our visitor is a man of considerable wealth and meticulous grooming. "And you deduce a tragedy from this?" "I deduce a desperation that overrides his natural inclination toward privacy," Holmes replied, finally untangling his limbs and rising to his feet. "Men of his class do not pace the pavement of Baker Street in the heat of the day unless they are driven by a terror that conventional authorities cannot assuage. Ah, he has finally found his courage." A sharp, sustained ringing of the doorbell echoed up the stairs. A moment later we heard the heavy tread of Mrs. Hudson ascending, followed by the opening of our sitting-room door. "Mr. Arthur Faircroft, sir," Mrs. Hudson announced, stepping aside to admit the pacing gentleman. Faircroft was a man in his late 50s, with a face that might once have been handsome but was now deeply lined and pallid. His eyes, a pale watery blue, darted frantically around our chaotic sitting room, taking in the chemical apparatus, the scattered papers, and the bullet pocks adorning the wall. He clutched his walking stick with white-knuckled intensity. "Mr. Sherlock Holmes?" he asked, his voice trembling slightly. "I am he," Holmes said, stepping forward with that sudden, surprising courtesy he could adopt when a case promised to relieve his ennui. "And this is my friend and colleague, Dr. John Watson, before whom you may speak as freely as you would before myself. Pray, take a seat, Mr. Faircroft. You look as though you have suffered a severe shock." Faircroft sank heavily into the armchair I offered him, placing his hat and stick upon the floor. He drew a pristine white handkerchief from his breast pocket and mopped his brow, though the sweat that beaded there seemed cold and clammy despite the stifling heat of the room. "A shock, Mr. Holmes?" Yes, that is an understatement," the man murmured, his eyes staring blankly at the unlit grate. "It is an absolute nightmare. I do not know where else to turn. The police, Inspector Hopkins, is a good man, I'm sure, but he's baffled, utterly baffled. And the press, if word of this gets out in its current, inexplicable form, the panic in the city will be catastrophic." Holmes rubbed his long, thin hands together, his eyes glittering with a sudden, sharp interest. The lethargy of the past 3 days had vanished in an instant. The bloodhound had caught the scent. "The city, you say?" Holmes murmured, reaching for his briar pipe and beginning to fill it from the Persian slipper by the fireplace. "Then I take it your distress concerns a matter of high finance. You are, if I'm not mistaken, the junior partner in the banking firm of Crosby, Faircroft and Vance of Lombard Street." Faircroft stared at him in amazement. "How could you possibly know that? I did not give my full business title to your landlady." "It is my business to know things," Holmes replied smoothly, lighting his pipe and blowing a plume of blue smoke toward the ceiling. Your firm underwrote the recent rather controversial loans to the Peruvian railway expansion. A bold move, but one that has caused considerable unease among your investors. However, your current state of agitation suggests a crisis far more immediate and personal than a fluctuation in foreign bonds. What has happened to Silas Crosby? Faircroft gasped, his pallor deepening to the colour of old parchment. He is dead, Mr. Holmes. Silas was found dead in his study this morning. I sat forward in my chair. Silas Crosby was a name known to anyone who read the financial pages. He was a titan of London banking, a man of immense wealth, ruthless business acumen, and notoriously eccentric habits. He was famously reclusive, a lifelong bachelor who governed his financial empire from a fortified, fortress-like mansion in Kensington, venturing out only when absolutely necessary. "Dead," I ejaculated. "But the evening papers mention nothing of an illness." "He was not ill, Doctor," Faircroft said, his voice dropping to an awed, terrified whisper. "He was murdered. At least, that is what Hopkins and I believe. But the manner of his death, it defies all reason. It is diabolical. It is unnatural." Holmes leaned back, closing his eyes, the very picture of serene concentration. "Pray, Mr. Faircroft, compose yourself. Start from the beginning. Omit no detail, no matter how trivial it may seem to your distressed mind. It is often the most trifling detail that provides the thread which unravels the entire tapestry." Faircroft took a deep breath, his hands shaking as he gripped the arms of the chair. He spoke slowly at first, but as the narrative progressed, the words tumbled from him in a frantic torrent. "Silas, as you may know, was a difficult man. Brilliant, undoubtedly, but intensely suspicious. He lived alone in that massive house in Kensington, attended only by a skeletal staff. His butler, Hives, his cook, and a single maid. He suffered from high blood pressure and an array of nervous complaints, for which his personal physician, Dr. Julian Arbuthnot, prescribed a strict regimen of rest and somewhat archaically weekly hirudotherapy. "Leechcraft?" I interrupted, unable to hide my medical scepticism. "A remarkably antiquated treatment for hypertension, though still practised by some of the older school." "Exactly, Doctor," Faircroft nodded. "Silas despised the treatments, but he trusted Arbuthnot implicitly. Every Thursday evening, Dr. Arbuthnot would visit the house, apply the leeches, and then leave Silas to rest in his study. Silas had a strict rule. Once the doctor left, he was not to be disturbed under any circumstances until 9 o'clock the following morning. He would lock the heavy oak door of his study from the inside. The windows, thick plate glass, were always bolted shut and heavily draped, for he suffered from a morbid fear of assassins following a rather nasty incident with an anarchist some years ago. "A locked room," Holmes murmured, his eyes still closed. "The quintessential conundrum. Proceed." "This morning, at 9 o'clock precisely, Hives knocked upon the study door to bring Silas his morning tea," Faircroft continued, his voice trembling. There was no answer. Hives waited a quarter of an hour, then knocked louder. Still nothing. Alarmed, he summoned me. I live but 2 streets away, and we decided to force the door. We had to use a heavy iron fireplace poker to smash the lock. It was a formidable barrier. Faircroft paused, swallowing hard, his eyes wide with the memory of what he had seen. The room was perfectly ordered, no sign of a struggle. The windows were firmly locked from the inside, the dust on their sills undisturbed. And Silas was sitting in his high-backed leather armchair by the cold hearth. He was dead. "What were the post-mortem appearances?" I asked, my professional instincts aroused. "Any signs of violence? Strangulation? Poison?" "None," Faircroft said. "His face was purple, Doctor, horribly congested, his eyes bulging from their sockets in an expression of absolute agony. But there was no wound, no weapon, no sign of any intruder. Only—" He hesitated, a shudder racking his frame. "Only what, Mr. Faircroft?" Holmes prompted, his eyes snapping open, blazing with an intense predatory light. "Only the leech, Mr. Holmes, attached to the side of his neck, directly over the jugular vein. But it was not a normal leech. It was enormous, bloated beyond belief, and it was red, a vivid, sickening, unnatural crimson. It pulsed, Mr. Holmes, even though the man was dead. I swear to you, it pulsed." A heavy silence fell upon the sitting-room. The ticking of the mantel clock seemed suddenly deafening. I looked at Holmes. He was completely motionless, staring intently at Faircroft. The lethargy was utterly banished. He was a taut bowstring, vibrating with intellectual energy. "A red leech," Holmes repeated softly, savouring the words as though tasting a rare vintage. "And Inspector Hopkins?" "Hopkins arrived shortly after I sent for the police. He examined the room, confirmed the doors and windows were sealed from the inside. He examined the body, but would not touch the creature on Silas's neck until the police surgeon arrived. He sent me to fetch you, Mr. Holmes. He said this was entirely beyond his purview." Holmes leaped to his feet with the agility of a panther. "Watson, your medical bag, if you please, and your revolver. A man who can bypass a locked door and murder a titan of industry with a crimson slug is not an adversary to be taken lightly. Come, Mr. Faircroft. The game is afoot, and we have not a moment to lose." The journey to Kensington was undertaken in a tense, brooding silence. Faircroft, exhausted by his narrative, slumped in the corner of the cab, his eyes closed. I watched the bustling streets of London roll past, my mind swirling with the bizarre parameters of the case. A locked room, a man dead with the symptoms of asphyxia or severe cardiac arrest, and a monstrous red leech. Holmes, conversely, was a flurry of activity. He produced a small, battered notebook and scribbled furiously for the first half of the journey. For the second half he sat with his chin resting upon his hands, his eyes fixed on nothingness, lost in the labyrinth of his own deductions. "Tell me, Mr. Faircroft," Holmes said abruptly as our cab turned onto the wide tree-lined avenue that led to the Crosby estate. "What was the state of the fire in the study?" Faircroft blinked, startled from his lethargy. "The fire? It was unlit, Mr. Holmes. As I mentioned, it is a sweltering May. Silas had not had a fire laid in weeks." "And the ashes in the grate?" I did not notice, sir. I was rather preoccupied with the corpse of my partner." Holmes nodded, his face unreadable. "Quite so. And Dr. Arbuthnot? Where does he reside?" "In Harley Street. A very distinguished practice. He is renowned for his work with the nervous system and the heart." "A cardiologist who employs leeches," I muttered. "A strange dichotomy." "A dichotomy indeed, Watson," Holmes agreed. "But we must remember that the greatest crimes are often committed by those who possess the greatest knowledge of the human body's frailties." "Ah, Here we are." The cab pulled up before a massive set of wrought-iron gates set into a high brick wall topped with jagged glass. Beyond the gates stood the Crosby mansion. It was a bleak, forbidding structure of dark stone, its narrow windows staring out like blind eyes. It looked less like a home and more like a mausoleum. A uniformed constable stood guard at the front door. Recognizing Holmes, he touched his helmet and opened the heavy oak portal. We stepped into a cavernous, dimly lit entrance hall, where the air was noticeably cooler and smelled faintly of beeswax and old paper. Inspector Stanley Hopkins, a bright, eager young detective for whom Holmes held a grudging respect, came hurrying out of a side corridor. His usually ruddy face was drawn and pale. "Mr. Holmes, thank God you're here," Hopkins exclaimed, wringing Holmes's hand. "And Dr. Watson. I am very glad of your presence, sir. The police surgeon, Dr. Anstruther, has just arrived, but he is as baffled as I am." "Let us dispense with the pleasantries, Hopkins," Holmes said briskly, shedding his light coat. "Take us to the room." Hopkins led us down a long hallway, panelled in dark mahogany. We stopped before a heavy brass-studded oak door. The wood around the lock was severely splintered, the heavy brass mechanism hanging loose, a testament to the force required to break it open. "The key was on the inside, Mr. Holmes," Hopkins said, pointing to the keyhole. "Turned in the lock, and a heavy iron bolt at the top was drawn. We had to use a crowbar on the doorframe to shift the bolt." Holmes produced his magnifying glass and dropped to his knees. He spent a full 5 minutes examining the splintered wood, the brass lock, and the dust on the floorboards before the door. I watched him trace the trajectory of the splinters, his face practically brushing the floor. Finally he rose, dusting off his trousers. The door was undoubtedly forced from the outside, and it was certainly locked from the inside, Holmes announced. "No trickery with a string and a key here. Let us examine the interior." We stepped into the study. It was a large, imposing room, lined from floor to ceiling with glass-fronted bookcases packed with ledgers and heavy tomes. A massive mahogany desk sat in the centre of the room, impeccably tidy, save for a single leather-bound diary lying closed upon the blotter. Heavy velvet drapes covered the tall windows, plunging the room into gloom, though someone had lit the gas lamps on the walls. And there, in a high-backed leather armchair drawn up beside the cold, empty fireplace, sat the body of Silas Crosby. He was a large man, barrel-chested, dressed in a silk smoking jacket and a stiff-collared shirt. But it was his face that commanded our horrified attention. Faircroft had not exaggerated. The banker's face was a horrific, bruised purple. His eyes, wide and bloodshot, bulged from their sockets, staring sightlessly toward the ceiling. His mouth was open in a rictus of agony, his tongue slightly protruding and dark. "Cyanosis," I murmured, approaching the body with my medical bag. "Classic signs of severe anoxia. He was deprived of oxygen, Holmes, strangled or smothered." "But look at his neck, Doctor," Hopkins said, his voice trembling. I leaned in closer. The collar of his shirt was unfastened. There, attached to the right side of his neck, directly over the carotid artery, was the monstrosity Faircroft had described. It was roughly the size of a large thumb, but swollen and bulbous. Its colour was a shocking, vivid red, unlike the dark, muddy green of any medicinal leech I had ever seen. It clung tight to the flesh, its surface shining wetly in the gaslight. "Fascinating," Holmes breathed, stepping up beside me. His eyes were wide with a feverish intensity. He brought his magnifying glass down to within an inch of the creature. A most singular specimen. Notice the lack of segmentation, Watson. A typical Hirudo medicinalis possesses distinct annulations. This creature's surface is entirely smooth, and the colour, it is not the colour of blood. It is the colour of painted lacquer. "Painted?" Hopkins cried. "You mean it is artificial?" "I mean we must not let appearances deceive us," Holmes said softly. He reached into his pocket and produced a pair of long, silver forceps. "Watson, hold the lamp closer." I brought a gas lamp over, illuminating the grotesque scene. With extreme delicacy, Holmes clamped the forceps around the middle of the red, swollen body. He pulled gently. The creature did not yield. He pulled harder, his jaw setting. With a sudden, sickening little pop, it detached from the flesh. Holmes held the creature up to the light. It did not writhe. It did not twist. It hung perfectly rigid in the forceps. "Good heavens," I breathed. Where the creature's mouth should have been, there was a tiny, hollow steel needle, no thicker than a horsehair, gleaming in the light. Holmes lowered the creature, his face alight with the triumph of discovery. "Gentlemen, we are not dealing with a creature of nature, but a creature of extraordinary diabolical artifice. This is no leech. It is a miniature syringe, a masterpiece of micromechanics, disguised as an annelid." He turned the object over carefully. "Ah, look here, a tiny seam along the underbelly. And beneath this red casing, yes, I can feel the rigidity of metal. Glass and brass, Watson. This little demon did not draw blood out of Silas Crosby. It injected something into him." I quickly examined the neck of the corpse. Where the needle had been, there was a minute, angry red puncture mark. "You are right, Holmes, but what could it have injected to cause such rapid, catastrophic cardiac failure? A massive dose of an opiate? Prussic acid?" "That, my dear doctor, will be for your chemical analysis to determine," Holmes said, wrapping the mechanical leech carefully in a linen handkerchief and placing it in his breast pocket. "For now, we have established the how. A locked room ceases to be a mystery when the murder weapon is small enough to be concealed inside the collar of the victim's own shirt, programmed to deliver its fatal payload when the victim is alone and at rest." "But who?" Faircroft asked, stepping into the room, his face green. "Who could design such a nightmare?" "That is what we must uncover," Holmes replied, his eyes sweeping the room. He dropped to his knees again, this time examining the cold hearth. "You said Dr. Arbuthnot attended to him last night, Faircroft?" "Yes, Thursday night. The usual leech therapy." "And did the doctor bring his own leeches?" "I believe so, in a small glass jar." Holmes took out a small brush and began lightly sweeping the ashes in the grate. "Ah, what have we here?" From the grey dust he extracted a small, blackened lump. He blew on it and held it up. It was the charred remains of a small, thick glass jar, its brass lid twisted and melted by heat. "The doctor brings a jar of leeches," Holmes mused. "He applies one. He leaves. Crosby, perhaps feeling the chill, or perhaps instructed to do so, lights a fire. He throws the jar into the flames. Why? Perhaps to destroy the remaining leeches?" Hopkins suggested. "Or perhaps the murderer, in his haste to destroy the evidence of his deception, lit a sudden blaze himself before locking the door from the outside," Holmes countered. Watson, examine the body further. Hopkins, I want you to secure the house. Let no one leave. I must have a word with the staff. For the next hour I conducted a thorough examination of the deceased, while Holmes moved silently about the house. I found no other marks of violence, no signs of struggle. Crosby's heart had simply rebelled violently and ceased to function. The sheer rapidity of the death pointed to a highly concentrated, fast-acting toxin, administered directly into the bloodstream via the carotid artery. When Holmes returned to the study, his face was unreadable, a mask of cold, calculating intellect. "The servants are of no use," he announced. "Hives is a loyal dog, blind to anything but his master's comfort. The maid is hysterical. Neither heard anything in the night. The locked room was merely an incidental detail, not the core of the murderer's plot. The killer relied on the mechanism to do the work, knowing Crosby would isolate himself." "Then we must speak to Dr. Arbuthnot," I said. "We shall," Holmes agreed. "But first we must confirm the nature of the poison, and I must trace the origin of this infernal machine. No doctor, no matter how skilled, could construct a mechanism of this complexity without the aid of a master clockmaker or engineer. Watson, take the body to the morgue. Extract what blood you can from the area around the puncture. I am returning to Baker Street to dismantle our red friend." It was well past midnight when I finally returned to our rooms at 221B Baker Street. The air in the sitting-room was thick with the acrid fumes of hydrochloric acid and the sharp tang of Bunsen burner gas. Holmes was seated at his makeshift chemistry bench, a powerful jeweller's loupe strapped to his eye. Before him, under the harsh glare of a student lamp, the red Leech lay dismantled. It was a marvel of terrifying ingenuity. The outer casing was indeed vulcanized rubber, expertly moulded and painted to mimic the swollen texture of an engorged leech. Inside was a tiny coiled mainspring of blue steel, attached to a microscopic gear train. This gear train controlled a tiny piston, which sat inside a delicate glass vial no larger than a grain of rice. "Watson!" Holmes cried, looking up as I entered. "You are just in time. The mechanical genius of this device is astounding. It is activated by body heat. The expansion of a tiny bimetallic strip here releases the mainspring. The needle deploys, piercing the skin, and the piston slowly, inexorably drives the contents of the vial into the victim. It would take perhaps 10 minutes to empty. The victim might feel a slight pinch, nothing more than the bite of a real leech, before the poison took effect." "And the poison?" I asked, setting down my bag. Holmes pointed to a test tube containing a cloudy, yellowish liquid. "I have analysed the residue from the glass vial. It is a highly refined, concentrated extract of Digitalis purpurea, foxglove." "Digitalis!" I exclaimed. "But that is a medicine used to treat the heart." "In small doses, yes. It strengthens the contraction of the heart muscle," Holmes said grimly. "But in a massive, concentrated dose injected directly into the carotid, it would cause ventricular fibrillation. The heart would beat wildly out of control, then seize entirely. It induces exactly the symptoms we saw in Crosby: cyanosis, bulging eyes, sudden death." "And Dr. Arbuthnot is a cardiologist," I breathed, the pieces falling into place with a sickening thud. "He has access to Digitalis. He had access to Crosby's neck. He prescribed the Leech therapy." "It is a perfect, almost undetectable murder," Holmes said, his eyes gleaming. "Arbuthnot applies the mechanical leech hidden among the real ones. He leaves." The door is locked. The leech deploys the poison. Crosby dies of an apparent sudden heart attack, a perfectly natural end for a man with high blood pressure. But Arbuthnot made one fatal miscalculation. What was that? He assumed he would be the one called to pronounce the death. He would arrive, mournfully declare his patient dead of heart failure, and surreptitiously palm the mechanical leech, taking it away with him. He did not anticipate the formidable strength of Crosby's locked door, nor the fact that Faircroft and the police would break it down and find the body before he could return to retrieve his deadly toy. "Then we have him," I cried. "Let us go to Hopkins and have him arrested." "Patience, Watson," Holmes said, holding up a hand. "We have a theory, and we have a weapon. But we lack the absolute proof that ties Arbuthnot to the weapon. A clever barrister would argue that any of Crosby's many enemies could have slipped the device into the doctor's jar. No, we must find the man who built this mechanism. Only he can identify the buyer." Holmes returned his loupe to his eye, leaning closely over the disassembled mechanism. "Ah, what have we here?" he murmured, a predatory thrill in his voice. "Look closely, Watson. Stamped upon this microscopic gear train is an intricate maker's mark, the letters AV intertwined with a horological escapement. Our meticulous builder has left his signature." Armed with this vital clue, Holmes became a ghost. He discarded his usual attire and adopted the disguise of a stooped, grimy French mechanic, vanishing into the labyrinthine alleys of Soho and Clerkenwell, where the immigrant clockmakers, jewellers, and instrument builders plied their meticulous trades. I remained at Baker Street, analysing the blood samples from the morgue, confirming the presence of toxic levels of digitalis. By the evening of the following day, Holmes returned, stripping off his disguise to reveal a face flushed with triumphant exhaustion. "I have him, Watson," he declared, pouring himself a generous measure of brandy. "Herr Anton Vogel, a disgraced Swiss watchmaker living in a squalid garret off Leather Lane. A genius with micro-gears, but ruined by absinthe. He confessed, under the threat of being implicated in a murder, that he was commissioned 3 months ago to build a blood-letting automaton by a wealthy gentleman. Did he name Arbuthnot? He did not know the name. The man paid in gold and wore a heavy cloak and a silk scarf to obscure his features. However, Holmes's smile grew predatory. Vogel is a master craftsman. He noticed the hands that handed him the gold. They were the hands of a surgeon, Watson. Manicured, precise, with a distinctive callus on the middle finger of the right hand, the mark of a man who spends his life wielding a scalpel or a heavy pen. And the man smelled faintly of carbolic acid and lavender water. "Arbuthnot," I said. "It must be." "It is enough to set the trap," Holmes said. He went to his desk, took out a sheet of paper, and began to write rapidly. "Watson, I need you to deliver this note to Inspector Hopkins immediately. Tell him to assemble a half-dozen of his best plainclothes men. Tonight we visit Harley Street." Dr. Julian Arbuthnot's residence on Harley Street was a paragon of Victorian respectability. An immaculate brass plaque announced his name and specialties beside a heavy, dark green door. It was nearly 10 o'clock when Holmes and I, accompanied by Hopkins, rang the bell. We were admitted by a stern-faced manservant and shown into the doctor's consulting room. It was a large, opulent room, lined with medical texts and gleaming glass cabinets displaying surgical instruments. Behind a vast mahogany desk sat Dr. Arbuthnot himself. He was a striking man, perhaps 50, with silver hair, a neatly trimmed beard, and piercing, cold grey eyes. He looked up from a medical chart as we entered, his expression one of polite inquiry, entirely devoid of fear. "Mr. Sherlock Holmes, I presume?" Arbuthnot said, his voice deep and cultured. "And Dr. Watson, to what do I owe the honour of this late visitation? If it concerns poor Silas Crosby, I have already given my statement to the police." "It does concern Mr. Crosby," Holmes said, stepping forward. He did not take the chair the doctor indicated. "You stated that you left him at 8 o'clock on Thursday evening, in good health, following his hirudotherapy." "That is correct. His blood pressure was elevated, but the leeches were having their usual palliative effect." "You brought the leeches with you in a glass jar?" "I did. A specialized strain I import from France." "And what became of that jar, Doctor?" Arbuthnot's eyes flickered just for a fraction of a second, but it was enough. "I left it upon the desk. I assume Mr. Crosby disposed of it. He had a horror of the creatures once they had served their purpose." "He disposed of it in the fire," Holmes said softly. "But he did not dispose of the final leech, the one you placed upon his neck." Arbuthnot smiled, a cold, patronizing smile. "My dear Mr. Holmes, leeches fall off when they are engorged. It is the nature of the beast. I am deeply saddened by Silas's sudden cardiac failure, but as a medical man, Dr. Watson will tell you that hypertension is a silent killer." Holmes reached into his breast pocket. Slowly, deliberately, he drew out the linen handkerchief. He unfolded it and placed the dismantled intricate mechanism of the red leech upon the pristine blotter of Arbuthnot's desk. The gaslight caught the gleam of the tiny steel needle and the fractured glass vial. "Nature is full of wonders, Doctor," Holmes said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "But I have never known Hirudo medicinalis to possess a mainspring of blue steel, nor a venom sac filled with concentrated digitalis." For a long moment the room was absolutely silent. The ticking of a grandfather clock in the corner sounded like a hammer striking an anvil. Arbuthnot stared at the mechanism. His face did not change. His breathing did not quicken. Only his hands, resting upon the desk, slowly curled into fists. "A fascinating toy," Arbuthnot said finally, his voice devoid of emotion. "Where did you find it?" "Attached to the carotid artery of your late patient," Holmes replied. "We have the testimony of the watchmaker, Anton Vogel, who built the mechanism to your specifications. We have the chemical analysis proving the vial contained digitalis, a drug to which you have unlimited access, and we have the motive." "Motive?" Arbuthnot sneered. "Why should I kill my most lucrative patient?" "Because he was your patient, but you were his debtor," Holmes countered, leaning heavily upon the desk. "You owed Silas Crosby upwards of £80,000, a loan he called in last Tuesday." Arbuthnot's aristocratic composure did not waver. He merely sneered. "A fascinating story, Mr. Holmes, but you have nothing save the hearsay of a ruined, absinthe-soaked watchmaker. Any man in a cloak could have bought that toy. You cannot prove it was me." "I thought you might say that," Holmes replied, a dangerous smile touching his lips. "Vogel mentioned his client wore heavy gloves, but he noticed the man's clothes smelled strongly of carbolic acid and lavender water. Your exact distinctive scent, Doctor. Furthermore, he noted the client had a pronounced heavy callus on his right middle finger, born of a lifetime wielding a scalpel. Instinctively, Arbuthnot's right hand twitched, his thumb moving to cover the middle joint. Holmes pressed his advantage, his voice ringing like a bell. "Your design was flawless, Doctor, but your execution was ruined by panic. You lit the fire in that sweltering room yourself, didn't you?" Arbuthnot's eyes widened. "You needed a quick blaze to melt the glass jar and hide the fact that there was one less real leech inside," Holmes continued ruthlessly. "But you forgot the rudimentary laws of physics. Brass expands rapidly when exposed to sudden intense heat. You warmed the room before the bimetallic strip had fully set, warping the retraction spring. Your desperate attempt to destroy the evidence of the jar is precisely what destroyed the mechanism of your murder." Arbuthnot sank back in his chair, the colour draining entirely from his face. The cold, clinical detachment shattered, revealing the terror of a man who realized the noose was already around his neck. "And your final flaw," Holmes added coldly, "was failing to retrieve the jam device before the door was broken down." "I was delayed," Arbuthnot rasped, his facade entirely gone now, revealing the desperate, ruthless man beneath. "My carriage threw a wheel on the way to Kensington this morning. By the time I arrived, Hopkins was already there, and the room was sealed." He looked up at Hopkins, who had stepped forward, handcuffs drawn. "You are under arrest, Dr. Julian Arbuthnot," Hopkins said, his voice trembling slightly with the magnitude of the collar, "for the willful murder of Silas Crosby." Arbuthnot did not resist. He stood up slowly, smoothing the front of his waistcoat. He looked at Holmes with a mixture of hatred and grudging respect. "I suppose I should have used a knife," Arbuthnot said softly. "It is less elegant, but less prone to mechanical failure. A knife would have been investigated as murder immediately," Holmes replied. "Your intellect was your undoing, Doctor. You outsmarted yourself. You built a machine so complex, so perfectly tailored to the victim, that it could lead back to no one but you." As Hopkins led the doctor away into the London night, Holmes and I remained in the consulting room. Holmes picked up the dismantled pieces of the red leech, rolling the tiny brass gears between his long fingers. "A tragedy of intelligence, Watson," he murmured, his eyes reflecting the dim gaslight. "When a doctor goes wrong, he is the first of criminals. He has nerve and he has knowledge. Palmer and Pritchard were among the heads of their profession. This man, Arbuthnot, was highly educated, deeply respected, and yet, when cornered by his own greed, he turned his brilliant mind to the creation of a miniature engine of death." "It is a chilling thought," I agreed, shuddering as I looked at the dark wood of the desk where the murderous plot had been hatched. "Indeed," Holmes said, placing the pieces back into his handkerchief and slipping them into his pocket. "I think I shall keep this, Watson. A souvenir of a case that proved that no matter how sophisticated the mechanism, no matter how clever the disguise, murder remains the most primitive and ruinous of human endeavours." He turned and walked toward the door, his Inverness cape swirling around him. "Come, Watson. The air in here is thick with the stench of corrupted intellect. Let us go back to Baker Street. I believe there is a cold partridge in the larder, and I have a sudden overwhelming desire to play Mendelssohn." And thus concluded the bizarre and gruesome affair of the Red Leech. The subsequent trial of Dr. Arbuthnot was a sensation, though the full details of the mechanical device were suppressed by the judge to prevent copycats. Arbuthnot, stoic to the end, made no defence, and met his fate upon the gallows at Newgate with the same cold clinical detachment he had shown in his consulting room. As for Holmes, he kept the dismantled Leech upon our mantelpiece for many years, a small, silent reminder that the darkest monsters are not those found in nature, but those forged by the hands of men. Thanks for joining me for another original mystery. Do not forget to check out our Patreon down below to support the channel.